Grade 9, Ahlan wa sahlan ya Hamir. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone is doing well in these strange times. I miss everybody very much, and I hope that we will be seeing each other soon. Until that time, I am going to continue to give you lessons here on our Google Classroom platform. And I hope that we can basically continue to do what we normally do in the class. So we've done a few lessons on, we finished up the human geography of Europe. Now my plan today is to move on. We're going to skip a few chapters, so we're going to move on to chapter 19 and start talking about the human geography of Africa. But before we start, I want to thank everyone who's been completing the assignments, going on the website every day and making sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I really appreciate that, and for doing that, you will be rewarded with points. So I know this might, be a new experience still, but I encourage everybody to try and get used to it because, as I think I mentioned before, this will be required. You will be required to do something like this in the future if you plan on going to the university. So, today, chapter 19, the human geography of Africa. And we're going to begin to cover section 1, East Africa. So, let's get into it, okay? And here's the plan. It's probably going to be the same old boring stuff here. Theme 1, we'll have 4 themes. Theme 1, we're going to talk a very brief history of East Africa. Very brief. Theme 2, we'll go over the colonial era in East Africa and its impacts. Theme 3, we'll talk about the economy. And Theme 4, some of the cultures that you see in East Africa. So this is what we're going to be doing, and this is the plan of action for the lesson. So let's begin. So theme 1, a brief history of East Africa. Before we start, if you look off to the left there in the map, this is what we mean by East Africa, the territories that are highlighted in orange there. So we have Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda, countries like that. This is considered East Africa, okay? And East Africa historically has often been referred to as the cradle of civilization. That's because some of the earliest prehistoric remains of, the earliest human-like creatures have been found here. For example, I believe it's in Tanzania / Kenya, there's something called the Rift Valley. And this is where many theories of, archaeologists and anthropologists believe that, we as humans, evolved here, became humans in this area. So many people argue that this is where, human beings, Homo sapiens, were born. So it has a very, very, very deep history, and what we're covering here does not do it justice. It's also in this area in East Africa, it's believed that people, some of the first peoples began to learn how to use stone tools here, and this technology spanned out to the rest of the world. So a lot of things happening prehistorically in East Africa. And if you also look at the map, you look at its geographic location. So not only does, East Africa have, access to the interior of Africa, it's also along the sea, particularly the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. So East Africa has also become kind of a cultural crossroads because of its location along the sea, and it's encountered, many different people because of trading, as we'll see. And there's a typo here on the PowerPoint, and I apologize for that. Still continuing on theme 1, there's moving beyond the prehistorical period East Africa became home to many civilizations, like kind of like empires, if you will. And the most famous was the Kingdom of Aksum, which was located in what is now modern-day Ethiopia. And the Kingdom of Aksum rose to power and prominence because of trade. They were very good traders, and they took advantage of their geographic location along the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. They actually controlled a lot of the trade routes there, and they grew into a powerful kingdom. They had some famous rulers. I don't know if you've heard of them. King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba are traced back to the Kingdom of Aksum, although that might be things of legend. But anyways, this was a major civilization that shaped part of the history here in East Africa. But in the 6th century, the Kingdom of Aksum began to weaken due to a change in the trading routes, meaning that Aksum did a lot of business with traders from India. However, it wasn't until or during the 7th century these traders from India figured that they could go up through the Persian Gulf rather than the Red Sea. So that was one of the reasons why the Aksum Empire weakened, because people were taking their goods through alternate routes. I mean, that's just one factor. There were other civilizations began to emerge around them that challenged them. Another reason too, but the combination of this led to the weakening of the Aksum Empire. However, despite the decline of the Kingdom of Aksum, East Africa continued to be an important trading center. From the 8th century on, the Arabs, Indians, Persians used East Africa as trading posts. So if we can kind of look at a map here, and this is in your book. Here are some of the trading routes. So the Kingdom of Aksum is here, and I'll show you another map of the Kingdom of Aksum. So we're talking like right here. So you see how their location, they would get, people from India would want to get their goods up the Red Sea. They would make a pit stop in Ethiopia. And also, the Aksumites had access all along the East African coast here. And this is what I'm talking about when I said there was a change in routes. So if you wanted, the Indians figured out it's faster to get to Persia going through the Persian Gulf. They figured it out. You could go up through here. So that cut into the trade of the Aksumite kingdom here. So this is just a visual to show you how the trade routes changed and where the trade routes for the Aksumite kingdom. Anyways, back to the PowerPoint. And here's an actual depiction of the Aksumite Empire at its peak around 700 AD. And as you can see, they even spanned into the Arabian Peninsula. So what is now modern-day Yemen. It is believed that Aksum actually controlled this territory, because it's a stone's throw to Yemen there. So they controlled this area here. Okay, so that's kind of the brief, early history of East Africa. So now what we can do is move into theme 2, the colonial era. So you have the Aksumite kingdom. Other civilizations there, are thriving throughout the centuries. However, the 19th century was not a good century for East Africa. Why? That basically is because of the Industrial Revolution that started happening in Europe at this time, in the early 1800s. So, because these European countries are experiencing the Industrial Revolution, they need raw materials to fuel their factories. What do you do when all the raw materials run out in your own country, such as Great Britain? Well, you start to look elsewhere. And that's exactly what these European countries did. It didn't take them long to figure out that Africa as a continent as a whole was flush with natural resources. And this includes East Africa. So they began to colonize Africa, and East Africa was no exception. And East Africa fell victim to colonialism after something called the Berlin Conference in 1884. So what the Berlin Conference was all the colonial powers got together. They said, okay, there's Africa, there's a bunch of natural resources there. We can go in there, no problem, control the people, control the territory. Let's do it. So these European powers agreed that any country could go into Africa and claim a territory as long as they could prove that they could control it. Pretty easy to do. So Great Britain could go into East Africa and say, okay, I want this territory. Look, see, I can control it. Okay, good, it's yours. And that's it, as simple as that. Then wasn't before long, you have, the British in there exploiting labor, exploiting the resources, and fueling their industrial revolution at home. And also what the Berlin Conference did is that it carved up the territory. It made lines, boundaries in lands that never knew boundaries before. So they divided East Africa without regard for ethnicity, language, or religion. So ethnic groups that traditionally didn't like each other were now bound territorially by these artificial boundaries drawn by the colonial powers. And as we will see, things like this would lead to future conflicts, and these conflicts, continue to impact the region to this day. And I have here the Rwanda genocide for an example. The Rwanda genocide took place in 1994, and you could trace its origins and its causes back to Belgian colonial control and how they pitted the Hutu and the Tutsi against each other. And when the Belgians pulled out in 1960, these tensions remained between the ethnic groups, and in 1994 it boiled over and resulted in about 1 million people being killed, ethnically cleansed. And that's you can trace that back to colonialism, so it's serious, the impact of colonialism on East Africa to this day. So here's just a little visual for you on the partition of Africa after the Berlin Conference. And partition basically means splitting up. And if you look in the area of East Africa, you see something called the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia was taken by the Italians. So mainly, the British and the Italians were the main players in East Africa. However, it got cut off here, but you see this area here where modern-day Ethiopia is on the map. It's called Abyssinia or something. That means neutral or independent. Why? Because Ethiopia, for years, was actually able to resist colonial control. They were led by a guy named Menelik II, and he was able to purchase guns from France and Russia, and he was able to actually defeat and keep out the Italians who tried to control what is now modern-day Ethiopia at the time. So they resisted for a long time. So Ethiopia was able to keep the colonizers out for a long time. Just a little side note there. So now, theme 3, the economy of East Africa, and this kind of, integrates with our previous theme of colonization, because the economy of East Africa was and is heavily shaped by its colonial history. So East Africa is roughly 70% rural. This means most people depend on farming or animal husbandry for survival. Animal husbandry means you raise animals. So it's a very, very rural place, and people still farm to survive there. More specifically, East Africa relies on something called cash crops, such as sugar, tea, and coffee for income. Now, a cash crop is a crop grown for its commercial value rather than its use by the grower. In other words, the crop makes money. So you would grow this crop and export it to, outside markets. And this is strictly a result of colonialism. So the British came in and said, we want to get, the climate here is suitable for growing tea. Tea is very popular on the international market. Guess what all the farmers here are going to do? They're going to grow tea, and we're going to take it and we're going to export it and we're going to make a lot of money. So once colonialism ended, and the British pulled out, the economy continued to carry on this way, like these newly formed countries such as, Kenya, Uganda, Somalia. So the people continued to grow cash crops. Unfortunately, the colonialists that set up these cash crop economies did not care that, it's a risky business. Very often, the prices of these cash crops fluctuate on the global market, so the prices go up and down. So when if you're dependent on tea for your, economy's income and the price is high, good for you. However, when the price becomes low or more competitors that grow tea come into the market, that can be devastating economically, especially when you don't have any other alternative sectors such as, manufacturing or anything like that. So this is why you see a lot of these African countries here that are very poor, because their economies were set up on a cash crop basis. And, that's another problem with cash crops, because the motivation behind it is for profit. So the farmers are not producing crops that can actually be used to feed the population. So why aren't they growing tomatoes? Why aren't they growing, cucumbers? Why aren't they growing rice? They can't. The entire country and economy is dependent on a cash crop like sugar or tea. So this has been problematic for the economies of East Africa. And again, like most other places that we talk about, East Africa is no exemption from urbanization or populations moving to the cities. However, despite people looking for a better life in the city, this has created many problems for these cities because the infrastructure can't support these large population movements. They don't have enough water pipes or roads or an in-place healthcare system that can support people, and also when large populations move to the city, they have to be fed. And because of the cash crop system, the agricultural sector cannot keep up with feeding these urban populations. So, because they're not growing enough food that can actually be used by the population, you have food shortages and things like that in the cities. So, in East Africa, the transition into statehood, or what we would call a country, has been very, very rough and very difficult because of its colonial experience, I would say. It has impacted, the political landscape and what we've been talking about here, the economy. So it's been bad. So that covers the economy. And that moves us into our final theme here, talking a little bit about the culture in East Africa, and particularly the maintenance of traditional culture in East Africa. So, going back to the previous slides, the location of East Africa is where many people have met because of its location on the sea and things like this. So what we have seen in East Africa is the emergence of a number of different ethnic groups. multiple languages, multiple religions. I think your book gives an estimate of about 160 different ethnic groups in the region, which is probably more depending on how you define ethnic group. And these ethnic groups in East Africa live across differing geographies, and they display a variety of cultural traditions such as clothing, language, and religion. And two examples are the Maasai and the Kikuyu. The Maasai have maintained their traditional culture and way of life. So they are basically farmers and pastoralists that live in the grasslands of like Kenya. And they wear things, like animal skin clothing. They still live like tribally out in, faraway lands. However, on the other hand, an ethnic group in East Africa, such as the Kikuyu, have kept some of their traditional culture, but they have also adapted to, the modern culture of the city life, kind of. So there's like a blending of culture there, and I'll show you some visuals here in a minute. And there are about 6.6 million Kikuyu in Kenya today. I meant to put in Kenya there, and there's a couple typos. Again, I apologize. So here is a visual of the Maasai. And as you can see, they are keeping it real. They have their, animal skin shields there, very, very traditional clothing. They speak a distinctive language. So they've kept their traditions and ways of life in East Africa, as opposed to the Kikuyu. So as you can see here, they kind of have like what you would say traditional looking clothing, but however, if you look at the men's, pants and shoes, it's kind of modern. So you kind of see. If you get what I'm saying, you see the blending of the traditional culture with the modern. So that's just an example. And I think that will be it for today's lessons. I hope you were able to bear with me there. And if there are any questions at all, you can always instigate a discussion on Google Classroom and or message me on WhatsApp. I prefer that we start to try and use Google Classroom. And I will continue to post lessons and continue to post assignments, so please check in every day. And my hope is to, within the coming days, to move on to section 2 and continue as we normally do. Thank you, and thank you for your attention, and thank you for your participation. I hope to see you soon.